To see you. Thank you for coming on a very hot evening when no doubt it's cooler outside. You could be having a beer and instead you're inside looking at a PowerPoint presentation, which speaks to your commitment to knowledge, I guess. It's really an honor to have Michael be the one to introduce me because I remember when I first heard about this issue, an issue that is not well known. There was no other book on it. There may have been writings in Nepali, but I don't speak Nepali, so I had no way of knowing this conflict. Yes, I had heard as a refugee person, I'd heard about these refugees from Bhutan and Nepal, but I knew nothing. And then I read his extraordinary book, and I feel so very privileged, Michael, that you are the one here introducing me today because you are the one who brought this to light in the global north. It must be said, many in Nepal already knew this story because they could write in Nepali, and many of the Bhutanese Nepalis already were communicating this. But in the global north, for those of us that are not able to communicate in Nepali, it's a new story. So I'll launch in and give you a bit of a summary of the book. I start with 3 examples, and that's because I'm an inductive learner, so I always learn by example. So the first one is this man named Ratan Ghazmir. Ratan Ghazmir left Bhutan after his release from prison, where he had been held because he penned pamphlets criticizing the government of Bhutan. He spent 18 years in a refugee camp in Nepal, along with 80,000 other ethnic Nepalis. I'll talk in a minute about the language we use to describe them. The Bhutanese government had contested the idea that he had been a citizen and that most of those ethnic Nepalis had been citizens of Bhutan. And Ratan got creative, armed with a scanner. And this was not a time when you could do it on your iPhone. This was the mid-1990s. He found a scanner in Kathmandu, had it brought near the refugee camps, and he and his team managed to get some documents from many of the refugees in the camp, about 50%, had them scanned, and then was able to use those to substantiate the claims that the refugees had. No, we really are citizens. Bhutanese government says we're not. We've got the evidence here. In fact, the CD-ROM that had that information on it was at that time handed over to Mary Robinson, who was then the UN Commissioner for Human Rights. The next story I want to tell, and the collecting of that data took place in Nepal. The next story I want to tell is a woman named Mangala Sharma, who was also a Bhutanese Nepali in Nepal. She was young and articulate and spoke English. She had a well-connected job working for the United Nations Development Program in Thimphu, the capital. And she spoke out about the government's treatment of the refugees, of the ethnic Nepalis, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. And subsequently, she and her very young family were served eviction papers from their home and threatened by their former neighbors. This was a person that had a good job in the capital. She realized that even that UN job couldn't protect her from what was happening in Bhutan, and she decided to leave. Her husband's family's house had been burned down. Her brother was imprisoned. She was an effective speaker for all of the things that had happened to the Bhutanese refugees, and I'll refer a little bit more to those in a bit. So she was sent. She got some funding, and she was sent to Australia, where she spoke on the radio. And she went to the United States, where she spoke about what happened. She even went to Beijing, the UN Conference on Women, which was quite famous in 1995. And there, in the presence of Bhutanese from the north, which was essentially the ethnic majority, she was able to speak about what had happened to her people on the international stage in Beijing. And finally, I tell you the story of Bhakta Gimbre. Bhakta Gimbre was he was working in a cement factory in a place called Samche, which is in southern Bhutan, when he heard these rumors that the Bhutanese Nepalis, otherwise known as the ethnic Nepalis, were being evicted from their homes following a national census exercise. He paid for a taxi to drive himself 7 hours to his parents' village to check on them, and he discovered an empty house. This is, of course, before cell phones. His family was gone. He crossed into India to find them, expecting to return back to Bhutan in a couple of days. But it turns out the Bhutanese Nepalis were moving in only one direction. They were leaving Bhutan, and they were not returning. Bhakta Gimre himself never returned to his job at the cement factory, and after 5 years of exile, he and other activists decided to organize a series of marches to show that all they wanted was a peaceful return to the country from which they had come. They had been labeled as anti-nationals, and this group wanted to show, no, we are peaceful. So they organized this series of marches, which went from Nepal, and you can see the dotted line. What their plan was to leave Nepal, walk through this little thin part of India, which was still a couple of days' walk, back into Bhutan and up to the capital, where they were hoping to petition the king directly. At the time that the group crossed into India, they were arrested. But within a couple of weeks, another wave of these marchers crossed into India and were then arrested. And this happened time and time again. While many were imprisoned and very few made it into Bhutan, Bhakta Gimre was in one of two groups that did make it all the way into Bhutan. And the images and the stories of the quiet, orderly masses walking through the streets, and then their subsequent arrests and imprisonment were critical to garnering public attention, at least in South Asia. And India served as the backdrop for this form of exile politics. So the three things that I've defined to you here that were done by Ratan Gazmir, Bhakta Gimre, and Mangala Sharma exemplifies this phenomenon, which I define as oppositional activism targeted toward the home country by those outside the country. This is often called diaspora mobilization, diaspora politics. And the way that I argue in this book is that exile politics has an ecosystem. In fact, I argue that it argues very much like a physical ecosystem. So just as there were 3 sites that I just talked about, or 4 or 5, it was Beijing, and it was Australia, and it was New York, and it was India, and it was Nepal, so many different sites where activism was occurring, the same thing happens actually in physical ecosystems, where they have the common purpose of surviving. Well, the common purpose of exile activists is to place pressure on the home country to make a change. With their differentiated abilities for producing, which could be producing information, which I call the carbon of activism. The most important part of a physical ecosystem is carbon, and the most important part of an exile system of exile politics is information. With their differentiated abilities for creating that, they mirror a lot the physical ecosystems of the world. So as in the natural world, some of these interactions are visible, as when demonstrators march with slogans, and sometimes they're clandestine, like the hushed cross-border work of gathering information across borders. And in a natural ecosystem, an organism's physical location, so its physical position relative to sun and water and shade, of course, defines exactly what that organism can do and how it can grow. And similarly, in exile politics, the same thing happens. Physical location matters. So this is the argument of the book. Physical sites shape what activists do. Physical location matters. And what I argue in the book and what I show in the book is that physical proximity to the home country matters. Being close to the place from which the refugees have fled gives them a certain advantage. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but why? But I argue it's not just a wonderful panacea. Being near the country from which you fled also renders refugees precarious. So proximity is a boon because it gives you the advantage of being able to engage in exile politics in some very advantageous ways, but it's also a bane. Precarity is very, very dangerous and problematic for many exile activists. So that's the book. If you were really pressed for time, you could leave now. I hope you don't. But that's the book. And now I'm going to tell you kind of sort of how I set it out. So I've got some literature review. I have a literature review in which and this is really just in the first book, and I'm really upset. Fiona, if I'd known you were going to be here, you should have been in here because you're in the book, but you're not on the bullet point. But I have the foundational literatures that I look at in the book, which are essentially 4 ways. The first is the spatial dimension of power. This is a well-known literature that looks, oh my God, you're right there. You're the very first name. I feel much better now, knowing that I put you right in. Fiona Adamson is right there at the top. Because I thought you were going to be in diaspora politics, but you actually cross over. Anyway, space itself has a kind of power, and we know this from a significant literature that looks at urban politics, that looks at the way that space is used, and understandings of spatial justice. Diaspora politics is a huge literature that essentially talks about the way that diasporas are rendered, persecuted in some way or another, depending on their levels of trauma or not, depending on their levels of displacement or not. And I point here to some of the progenitors of this movement. I can't help but mentioning that William Safran, who's kind of considered the father of diaspora studies, was actually the father of my ex-boyfriend's wife. So I actually got to meet him and talk to him. And of course, I tried to talk to him about diaspora politics, and he was like, I'm not interested in that anymore. That's what I did 20 years ago. Now I'm on to something else. But anyway, it was kind of cool to have an evening with William Safran. Transnational politics is the next literature that I look at. Scholars, people are very familiar with this, but this is essentially looking not at the international relations from state to state, but looking at what happens beyond the state, how individuals work with one another. They move beyond the state, they're under the state in order to transact. And exile politics is very much an example of transnational politics because you're working not between, for example, Nepal and Bhutan, although you may try to influence those states, but beyond that, above it and below it. And finally, the literatures of borders and power and precarity, the power to expel, the idea that borders are constructed, so what does it even mean to become a citizen, and precarity of place, that we are precarious because of that power. I point here specifically to Roberto Esposito, who talks about the immunitary tendencies of states, which is exactly to expel, just as the body identifies something foreign and expels it. Do I want to talk about this? I'll tell the short version. So, academic books that have social sciences, we try to talk about our positionality a little bit. And I share mine in the book because I do think it's important to my approach. You see here a picture of Balaram Podel, who was a very famous leader in exile politics after he fled and was in Nepal. He was a man that everyone told me I should meet, but everyone said, you can't meet him. He's too dangerous. He's a grizzled revolutionary. Also, he doesn't speak English, and it would be dangerous to meet him. And for many years, even though I had done research for many, I'd never met him. And then in 2019, when I was finally finishing up my research after 12 years, I was in Nepal and I had the opportunity to meet him. I had a trusted translator, an interpreter, excuse me, and he was in Kathmandu, and I met him. And it turned out he spoke English quite well. He had a very quiet, soft-spoken manner. He was a little bit arched over. And I had a wonderful 2-hour interview with him. He was very thoughtful about what his political party, the Bhutan People's Party, had done, maybe some mistakes that they made, but believed that those did not fully define the movement. And when he left, and before he left, he took my hands and put them on his head, which is quite unusual because the custom there would be that the elder person would put their hands on your head to honor you. So by taking my arms and taking mine and putting them on his head, it was a way of saying, I seek your honor. And he said, do good things for my people. And as he walked away, I was crying. And I had to ask myself why. And I realized that with his quiet demeanor and his hat and his stooped over figure, he reminded me of my own father, who was a refugee from Hungary. I tell this story not to compare Hungary and Bhutan, they were very different situations, but to confess that my positionality had the possibility of making me potentially not a fully objective researcher when it came to researching this population, and that's okay. I don't believe any researcher is fully objective. My positionality suggested that I might be open to certain things in certain ways because of my father's refugee background. In this picture, Balaram Podel is standing with Govinda Rajal, and I'll speak about him in a minute. Why Bhutan is a target for exile politics? This map is perhaps too simplistic for the people in this room, but here we see the little tiny mitten-shaped part of India that separates Bhutan and Nepal, and the reasons for which you could see that if you're in Nepal, you're actually quite proximate to Bhutan. The background. So whenever people hear Bhutan, they usually think of three words: gross, national, happiness. Those are the three. Whenever I say I do research on Bhutan's refugees, those are the first three words that come back to me. So what I say in the book and what I argue past the book is that Bhutan has been extremely successful in the process of Shangrilization. They are considered to be a jewel. The famous Tiger's Nest Monastery, which you see here on this gorgeous cliff, is kind of a symbol of their ability, their extremely successful ability to project themselves as a peaceful country that thinks first about green and then about development. But there is an ethnic minority population. There's actually several ethnic minorities in the country. In the book, I call them Bhutanese Nepalis. They've also been called Lhotshampa, which means southern residing peoples. And the settlement patterns of the Bhutanese Nepalis, and here I give great credit to Michael Hutt, who did great work in explaining all of this, had done some research in archives, in the British archives, to see sort of what had been claimed. But the settlement patterns is that the ethnic Nepalis had come from Nepal to Bhutan over a series of times. There was a very small group, although we don't know how small, that came centuries before, but had likely integrated into the broader population. And then from the 1900s and on, they came as part of a larger migration plan. This was part of what was happening in this new kingdom that became a kingdom only in the early 1900s. And the early on, and what is important to say is that it was early on that there were pushes for representation from that ethnic minority. So the story that I like to tell is the story of Masur Chetri, who was a man who essentially asked for thought his taxes were unfair. It was like a little one-man Boston Tea Party. And for his sins of asking for promoting this idea that the taxes he got was unfair, he was captured, put in a leather bag, and drowned in the Sunkosh River. Now, this narrative about Masur Chetri changes a little bit from person to person, but always you hear the story about the drowning, the Sunkosh River, and the leather bag, all the way through. In the 1950s, there was another sort of push for representation as those in the South realized that they were not represented by the North in the same way, by something called the Bhutan State Congress. Now, what I overlooked saying is that these Bhutanese Nepalis were very different from the Northerners. By appearance, they looked more like Nepalis. They were darker, whereas the ones in the north looked a little bit more like Tibetans. They spoke a different language. They spoke Nepali, whereas the language of the north was Jonka, and continues to be, by the way, and the religion was different. From most of the Nepalis were Hindu, and the Northerners were Buddhist. So the Bhutanese government, noticing a significantly large population in its south, started with integration policies. No more teaching of Nepali in the schools. Please wear these clothes that we consider to be important. ones that were very uncomfortable for those in the South. There was a 1988 census which found many of the residents not to be citizens. Were they really not citizens, or did they simply not have their paperwork? I cover this in detail. Michael Hutt covers this in detail. But the truth is, we know from the work of Ratan Gazmir that I showed you, is that many were in fact citizens. 1990, protests erupted. But the feudal kingdom of Bhutan had never seen anything like a protest. They had never seen people walking in the streets. And there was some violence, it must be said, but it did not matter that those protests were all of a sudden considered something that made the people that participated in them or had family members anti-nationals. And after that time, the Nepalis started, the ethnic Nepalis, the Bhutanese Nepalis started to be expelled. Very little known is that 1/6 of the population, in fact, was expelled from Bhutan across the border into India, and from there, what I call the shuttle and funnel approach, they were sent into Nepal. So what's important to know is that the narratives from the two sides were different, and this affected what happened with exile politics later on. According to the Bhutanese government, most in the country were not citizens anyway, and they left willingly because they signed what was called VMFs, voluntary migration forms. In fact, they were told to show their teeth, because by showing their teeth, it showed that they were smiling. Like that was the proof that they were actually happy to go. The Bhutanese Nepalis narrative was very different. It said that nearly all of them were citizens and that they did not leave willingly, they were coerced into signing. I have a quote here from one of my interlocutors who said, when my brother and I came home for winter vacation, there was a state of fear in the village. Every male was gone. The army came to the village and demanded our cows. They took my father and beat him in front of the village. They said to me, look at your nose. This country doesn't belong to you. You look like Girija, who was the current prime minister of Nepal at the time. He was the founder of the Nepal State Congress. So by saying that he looked like a Nepali, it was also this condemnation of everything that Nepal stood for, because Girija had just been part of the party that overthrew the monarchy, the panchayat system. So by essentially saying, you look like this person who was involved in changing your government, I am therefore scared of you. There was social terror in my town. Girls were scared of the army. The officers personally ordered us to leave Bhutan. So that's the history. I cover it more extensively in the book. But what happened when they crossed? Well, here I talk in the book about the power of proximity. And I divide that into three kinds of exile politics. Human rights documentation, essentially looking at the ways in which the refugee activists proved all of the troubling human rights problems that had happened within Bhutan. The calls for democracy. It was, after all, a monarchy, and it was one in which they felt like they did not have representation. And reversing exile. Those who had left and found themselves in camps did not want, they were not happy, oh good, I'm back in my homeland. No, Mangala Sharma had never been to Nepal. So they wanted to go back to Bhutan. So here I offer, in the chapter on proximity, I offer many examples of the reasons for which proximity offered advantages to the exiled activists. So the first I've already talked to you about was the digital database. You can imagine that going around a camp and collecting information from refugees about their land receipts, passports, is much easier when they're all together nearby. Imagine trying to do that once they've dispersed. So the digital database had great advantages, and they were able to do it quite cheaply. There was also the collective representation in the camp. Every year in the camps, they would tell the story of the history of the Bhutanese Nepalis, and of course it would start with Masur Chetri, who was drowned in the leather bag, right? So if you think about your own countries and you think about the stories that are told about the American Revolution in my case, or whatever country you're from, these are the stories, what I call the persecution refrain. What happened to our ancestors? Why are we the country we are today? Those stories were told in the camp. And of course, nearby, Bhutan, where they were all in this mass collective, it was easier to tell those stories of Masur Chetri. There were camp publications that allowed for the sharing of these stories. There were newsletters that targeted the embassies in Kathmandu. The marches that I've already mentioned that Bhakta Gimre participated in, these happened by foot and they happened by bike. This is a picture of one of the peaceful marches that happened in either 1995 or 1996. That's just on the bridge that connects Nepal and India across the Mechi Bridge. There were protests in Kathmandu. Now, Kathmandu is a little further away than the camps, but still much, much closer than much further afield. And finally, there was lobbying in Nepal and India, and I will say a little bit more about that. So we see from all of these examples that being close to the home country provided significant advantages to being able to engage in that politics. One example that I give in the book is this amazing publication that is published by, oh my God, what's it called? The Himalayan Review? What's it called? It was hosted here at SOAS, right?
No, we put it on Digital Himalaya.
Digital Himalaya, that was it.
Human rights organization.
Yeah. Digital Himalaya, that's what it was called. And it's still there. It's like I've read every single article in all 6 years I think it was published. And in this example, this is a really great example. This was a publication that came from those in the camps or those that were living near the camps, and afterwards was scanned, and you can find every single copy on Digital Himalaya. That's what it was called. So the Bhutan Review was cheeky and funny and clever and made fun of Bhutan. And it was also sad and sobering and talked about some of the stories of what had happened. And this example is one picture that was in the Bhutan Review because someone had snuck back into Bhutan and taken pictures of a house that had been destroyed. So here's someone that finds themselves no longer in Bhutan, and they see what had happened to their home. Now today, you may feel this has lost its power because of the internet, but you have to remember that in the 1990s, especially in the early 1990s, the only way you were going to get a picture like this was going back in and taking the picture and smuggling it out yourself. So that's exactly what happened here, and that was possible because of proximity. Maybe with drones today, that's not going to happen as much, but I come to that a little bit later, why I still think proximity is relevant. But along with proximity, the advantages of proximity, came the problem of precarity. Alexander Betts, who's a well-known scholar, made fun of me when I was writing the first draft of this because he said I had too many P's. The power of proximity and the problem of precarity. I really do like alliteration, but I probably should have chosen a different letter because it just makes you spit all over the place. Anyway, okay. So in the book, I tell about many of the problems that came with proximity in terms of precarity. So first, there were restrictions from the government of Nepal. Technically, the government of Nepal did not permit the activists to engage in activism. It is true that they did. Nepal was, in fact, rather generous compared to its treatment of Tibetans, for example, or, for example, the way that Nepalis were able to other populations in other countries, if you compare it relatively. But at any time, they could shut it down. They could say, stop those publications, and they did. Stop those marches, and they did. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees offered restrictions. Now, it is very tricky to get UNHCR to admit that they don't want refugees to engage in political participation. I could never really get those exact words on record, but they would say things like, we have a humanitarian mission. Our mission is humanitarian, so what we are there to do and what we are there to support is the feeding of refugees and offering shelter. They were not excited about refugees engaging in politics. Sad to say, there were a couple of marchers that died, and there are some very famous stories of extradition. those who, the most famous was Teknath Rajal, who I read about a lot in the book, but there were several who, once they were in Nepal, were actually captured by the Bhutanese government and taken back in to Bhutan. It is true, and we know this from transnational repression, that extradition can happen not only nearby, but it's certainly easier if your country is just across the border and you go in and you can grab people and bring them back across. I also read about one really interesting case, which is the attempted extradition of a man named Rongtong Kunli Dorji, RKD. So this is a picture of him, and you may look at this and say, well, Susan, he doesn't look Nepali. And you'd be right about that. Because, and I'm very proud that this is in the book because there's very little written about this, both in Nepali and in English, I tell the story of one other group of people involved in exile politics in Bhutan who were not Bhutanese Nepalis. They were another ethnic minority in Bhutan called the Sharchaps. And RKD was a Sharchap. He was a businessman, and he also didn't like what he saw happening to the Nepalis. He didn't like how he was treated as a businessman. He saw that the king and his cronies were sort of giving out favors, and that he was not able to he saw that he didn't have a voice. And he spoke up on behalf of the Bhutanese Nepalis, and he was also exiled. He was in some ways considered one of the most dangerous people in exile, because what he proved is that it wasn't just one ethnic minority complaining about their treatment. His voice showed this is a bigger problem. This is a problem of representation more broadly. And so the Bhutanese government was very eager to silence him, and they in fact had him arrested in India on a technicality that he wasn't supposed to be there. And in fact, it took the lobbying of some of the other members of the exile activists, and they knew those activists. Why? Because they were proximate, it took their lobbying to get a stay against that extradition. So he was never extradited back into Bhutan, and he was able to remain in India. But they essentially said, you have to be more quiet. And he died. He still did a few things, but not very many. So again, this tells you that tension between proximity and precarity. Things changed drastically in the mid-2000s. Two things happened. One was democracy in Bhutan. The king abdicated. His son became the next king, but also put forth the process of elections and democracy. In the book, I talk about the varying views of why democracy came to Bhutan. This has been argued that the king did it out of beneficence, or he did it strategically because he saw that it was time. The writing was on the wall. And was it organic? This is something that he felt was the right thing to do, or that he was pushed. And the Bhutanese Nepalis argue, no, he did it because he was pushed. It was our advocacy, they say, that created enough of a push for democracy. I am not willing to weigh in on that fully, but what I can say is that we can't say that it wasn't certainly part of the language, part of the discourse. So that changed things in Bhutan. I will speak in 1 minute about how it doesn't mean things are fully changed. The second thing that happened is that proximity and the precarity were in tension until the process of resettlement occurred. So I suspect that resettlement is familiar to everyone in this room, but the short version is that this is a process by which countries of the global north accept refugees that remain in the south for permanent protection in their own countries. And you can see from this the vast, the international refugee regime decided the Bhutanese Nepalis are a group that have been in camps for a while. We are interested in giving them permanent protection in our countries. You may ask, why the Bhutanese Nepalis? Why not the Somalis? Why not the Sudanese? There's many other populations that need it, and that is a completely separate question. But they decided to, in a process of mass resettlement, at that time there were 110,000 in the camps, and through this process about 101,000 were resettled. And you can see here these numbers. Now these numbers are old. I could not get newer numbers than this. I think this is from 2018, if I remember, but they're not going to be too much larger. And you can see that the UK resettled 356, Netherlands 301, and the United States 94,000, and 6,800 in Australia. The process of resettlement meant that all of that collective energy that I talked about, that was proximate, all those people that went to hear Masur Chetri, the story of Masur Chetri every year, the ones that did the marches, the ones that could tell their stories of what had happened to them, well, that mass wasn't there anymore. Some of them remain. There's still 7,000 in the camps, but many, many fewer. So what does that mean for a movement? What does that mean for exile politics? Oh, and just before I answer that question, important activists were settled. It wasn't just the mass, it was the activists themselves. So here we see Ratan Gazmir on the right in Adelaide. We see Bhakta Gimre, much looking very different from his young self. He lives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Mangala Sharma lives in Minnesota. So what is the effect on the ecosystem? Well, Alexander Betts and Will Jones have talked about what they call the life cycle of diaspora politics. They call diaspora death when a movement sort of dies out. I push back on that and I say it's a little more nuanced than that. I think that what we can see here is more of the cycle of a dawn. So one of the interlocutors I spoke to in the refugee camps at this time said, it looks a little bit like a sunset to us. But if you look at the entire ecosystem today, you can see a bit of a dawning. Now, some of this is in the book, and some of it has happened soberingly since then. But here I point to the example of the global campaign for the release of political prisoners in Bhutan. This is a group of young Bhutanese who are trying to push to get the release of 35 political prisoners that remain in Bhutan. They had escaped back into Bhutan after they had become refugees. Maybe they were trying to find their old houses, right? Maybe they were trying to sneak information in. They have been arrested. They were arrested, and they've been in prison since then. For years, their families were able to visit because they were in the camps, but not anymore. Those were facilitated by the Red Cross. So these 35 remain without really any hope and very, very lonely and very, very poor condition. And there's a group that's trying to campaign for their release through the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, through working with Human Rights Watch, and through protests. And here's an example where that ecosystem continues. They collect information from those that are still getting information across the border into Nepal and a little bit into India, and then they use the global north as the site for more protest. And I couldn't help, I know this picture looks very confusing, but I couldn't help but show it. Bhakta Gimre was someone that every time I spoke to him, he spoke about his deep love for Bhutan. And as soon as he got a passport in the US, he flew to India and he got as close to Bhutan as he could. And here, this is a picture of him, and this is just from Facebook, where he posted, look, Bhutan is just across the river. It's right there, but I can't go. So this expansion of the ecosystem, where once the refugees had passports, the activists had passports, they could move from place to place, and they could post about their experiences. Where's the Nepal part? Oh, I also just wanted to say in Nepal, there are things that remain. There are still things that are happening. There are publications. There are many fewer, it is true. And also we have one of the most important activists never left. His name is DNS Dakal, and he remained in Nepal. And he started what he calls a cultural complex, you might also call it a memorial museum, in which he has all of this memorialization of what happened with the expulsion. And he has a block which he talks about where all of those had been killed. And if you look carefully, you can see all of the people that it says shot and tortured. This is just one plaque in a list of many. But if you look, you can see the very first name. You guessed it, it's Masur Chetri, and he was drowned. So I say this to give you a sense of how ingrained are these stories and how much there is a need to want to continue the reconciliation. Or excuse me, some want to reconcile and some want to just get back into Bhutan. The King of Bhutan, this of course happened after the book. Well, the book was published 1 month later, but it was certainly not possible for me to include this information in the book. But in October 2024, the King of Bhutan came to Australia. He came, it is believed, because many young Bhutanese are leaving the country and they don't want to go back in. Or let's say they want to get good jobs outside the country. There's a problem with employment within the country. And he's trying to look to get them back in. And many are saying, look, you have a Bhutanese diaspora that is interested in getting back in. Why don't you use them? So this is an article written by the top one is written by a woman from Bhutan, and the bottom one is written by a Bhutanese refugee, which is to say, now that they're in the distant diaspora here in Australia, they were able to say, hey, this narrative we see that the Bhutan king is set to visit and everyone wants to visit him, hey, you're losing some out. You're missing some out. That's because there are now enough in the diaspora, their English is improved and that they can do that. I also want to say, I include this to say, we as academics often feel like we only write academic articles, and I'm really proud of this. I mean, it's not such a big deal. It's an article that I wrote that was essentially some of that impact stuff that we try to do a little bit, which was essentially to say, if you embraced your former refugees, King of Bhutan, you could rectify your nation's historical injustices. I wish I could say it had an impact. The king did not meet with any Bhutanese refugee populations while he was in Australia. As I said, there's still transnational activism that occurs in Europe. This is an example of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detection that has concluded that Bhutan engaged in patterns of discrimination against those of ethnic Nepalese origin. And this shows why we still need proximate spaces. So this is a post about the political prisoners. Ram Karki, up in the little corner, is based in the Netherlands. I'm actually going to speak in the Netherlands after I leave the UK. And 2 of the political prisoners that were released are still in Nepal. And Ram is in touch with them. So these proximate spaces where people go to, because those 2 that have been released cannot come to the United States, the resettlement, or anywhere. The resettlement program is over, and so they live as stateless in Nepal. But the possibility of speaking to them and using that evidence as a form of homeland activism remains. And finally, and this is the heartbreaking newest story, for which our activism is just starting. Most of the refugees that went to the United States by now have citizenship, but some never got it. They were busy, they didn't speak English well enough, they didn't get good advice. And of those who didn't get citizenship, there was a small proportion that committed minor infractions. And the United States has now deported those refugees. So this is not a new story for the United States. By the way, they did the same thing to the Cambodians. There were Cambodians that never got citizenship. And years later, after they had terrible integration and were in gangs, many were deported back to Cambodia. This story is a little bit different because those who were deported were sent back to Bhutan. Cambodia took back the Cambodians. Bhutan agreed to, allowed the planes to land, because Bhutan is trying to stay on the good side of the United States because it's being considered in that low category of people that can no longer come to the United States in Trump land. So didn't argue with Trump and didn't argue with ICE, but instead, the minute that those refugees landed, just sent them back across the border into India. India sent them back across the border into Nepal, and some of them are now in prison in Nepal. Not all of them. One was actually reunited with his father, who had never left, but this is not a happy story. This is not a happy reunion. And the mobilization that is starting about that is going to be a form of cross-mobilization. It's going to be homeland mobilization, because ironically, these are the first refugees that were actually able to go back. And yet, not really, not in a way that was in any way meaningful. So the mobilization is allow them to stay, but also to the United States, don't deport them. So here we see the kind of overlap of homeland and hostland mobilization. And those stories are heartbreaking, and that's an in-process story. So there's been no change for political prisoners. It's true that there were 2 released, but they were set to be released. God bless you. There has not been one Bhutanese refugee that's been permitted to return, except for those that were then pushed out again. There have been some openings for communication among Bhutanese Nepalis outside the country and those within, but there's significant fear to have those conversations. Democracy is definitely holding. This is not like Myanmar that sort of was a democracy and is now not. Democracy is holding, but there are gaps. There are still significant, oh my God, my brain. What's the word when you allow people in your family? Nepotism. There's significant nepotism or elitism within the country. There are future possibilities for reconciliation, and this could be supported by the entire exile politics ecosystem. This would be telling a more nuanced version of the history. There were mistakes made on both sides, and it took some maturing among the Bhutanese Nepali diaspora to admit that they weren't only traumatized, but they had made some mistakes. That nuanced version is not very well told in Bhutan, I am led to understand. Maybe possible return trips for refugees to see former classmates. Now with Facebook, they're starting to get in touch with people they haven't seen in 30 years. I mean, I'm hearing amazing stories. Remember that picnic? Remember that picnic we took in the river that day? What are you up to? I mean, really just so powerful. There's also a need for more gendered research, I will say. I had a couple of female interviews, but very, very few. But women did do a lot of that work. They didn't do it as publicly, but they did do that work. And so I think that's something that we need to think about. There's lots of intersectional issues with exclusion about caste as well, but I will say I did not talk about caste. I had it referenced to me a couple of times. I didn't feel I was the appropriate person to be writing too much about that. And it was clear from my interlocutors that that wasn't necessarily something, that wasn't the story at the time that they wanted to tell. You may ask, Susan, but what about Facebook? What about technology today? Does this make your argument about proximity irrelevant? And I would argue no. It is true that we no longer need proximate spaces as much as we did, but look at the example I just showed you of the 2 political prisoners that we are still in touch with through Human Rights Watch about what's happening within the country. There are also many countries today in which we cannot trust the internet. We know that Myanmar is often on shutdown, and it is monitored and sometimes turned off. And frankly, physical space allows us possibilities to interpret what is happening in different ways. There is still, today, a different understanding of things when we learn on Zoom and when we learn in person. And politics has to touch down somewhere. That's the argument I make. My last slide is just to say that this talk is given in memory of Govinda Rijal. Govinda wrote a beautiful book called A Pardesi in Paradise, which was a book that I read as carefully as I read Michael Hutt's. He was one of the people that was able to cross back into Bhutan. He was on those marches. He wrote about the first time he cried after all that had happened to him is when he got back into Bhutan and he realized no one there wanted him anymore. And he was summarily put on a bus and sent out. And he said, tears streamed back down my cheeks. I had the privilege of meeting him in Kathmandu, and he remained in Kathmandu. He never left for a country of the global north. He was never resettled. And quite tragically, last year, he was inadvertently, it was not a political thing or anything, he was hit by a bus. And the leaders of the movement were devastated. He had been such a stalwart part of the movement. So I dedicate my talk to Govinda Rajal. That's it. That's all I got. Thank you.
I have a question about how much the threats the Bhutanese government or the kingdom felt when they took such an effort to purge like 1/6 of its population out of the country.
Yeah.
Do they really felt that the body of a huge threat to the monarchy, or was just?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is in the book, and it's in Michael Hutt's book as well. I didn't cover it here, but it's in the book, but I really appreciate your bringing it up because it is important to say. It's important to remember that narrative. So the government of Bhutan saw the ethnic minority population, particularly of the Nepalis, as being a threat because of what was the language was called Greater Nepal. This idea that Nepalis in the region were seeking a larger Nepali state. And part of what made them scared of that is that the region of India called Sikkim, which was at one time its own Himalayan kingdom, went a different way. It no longer was its own sovereign kingdom because of voting within the country, in which there were many Nepalis. They voted to become a part of India. And so the idea that what could happen in Bhutan, what could happen in Sikkim might happen in Bhutan was very much in the minds, I think, of people of the north of Bhutan. I argue, Michael Hutt argues, and if you read sort of other histories of Sikkim, they were different enough that it was not the fear wasn't real. But we know that fear of migrants has nothing to do with reality. We know that fear is about constructed othering. But to be fair, there were things that were happening across the border that the Northerners were looking to. Kalimpong, we have someone here, a resident from somebody that came from Kalimpong. Kalimpong had been like a space of fervor, of revolutionary fervor for decades. It was a place where heady ideas mixed. That's Bhutanese Nepalis had come across the border. They were close to that border. They spoke the same language as people in Kalimpong. They came across the border to hear ideas. They would come then back into Bhutan and share those ideas. And because at the time it was a kingdom, those were ideas that were very threatening. Those were ideas that felt anti-monarchy. And to be fair, there was a little violence. There were two Bhutanese Nepalis who were in charge of the census and probably treated other members of the Nepali group disrespectfully, and probably weren't as careful with the censuses. I mean, they weren't the only one. There were a lot of people that were not careful with the census, but there were two village leaders who were beheaded. So there was violence. You know, this was not a pure activist movement that had not one fault with it. What activist movement is pure, that has had no violence? But that damaged the movement considerably, as one might expect, because it allowed for some gruesome details that could then be taken by the Northerners and said they're all monsters. They're all violent people, which was so far from the truth. But I appreciate your question. What's your name? Kaya. I appreciate your question, Kaya, because it is a really important part of the narrative. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, yeah, thanks for a great talk. I'm curious about the resettlement that you discussed. Did that happen, I don't know the case at all, did that happen all at once, and did people, presumably they applied to be resettled and waited a decade or however long? But so clearly the activists had wanted to go to kind of global north countries. And so how does that balance in terms of the proximity and having an influence versus feeling that either maybe it's for personal reasons or maybe it's more influence being abroad? If you can maybe just tell us
no, that's
a bit
a
more
great
about
question.
the whole resettlement story.
So it's in the book, but not in here. So actually, they did not. The activists did not want to resettle to the global north. And in fact, my very first visit, when I was told not to meet Balaram Podel, was because there was so much tension in the camps, because there were many activists that not only did not want to resettle, they didn't want anyone to resettle, because they felt that they would lose that power. It was blown out of proportion, though. So there were some that were happy to resettle right away, and there were some that said, well, let's just wait. Let's have enough power that we, because at the time, like, things were starting to happen with well, actually, no, that's not true. That was earlier. But the idea was, let's not lose the movement. So the first part of your question about the process of resettlement is that it was pretty quick. But at the beginning, the rumors that went around the camps about what this meant, and this is not unusual, I mean, this happens in resettlement processes at first, there was great suspicion, as you might imagine. Why is the richest country in the world taking us, taking tens of thousands of us? There was a belief that they wanted them to resettle so that they could force them to be soldiers and fight in the Iraq War. There were rumors that they were going to be injected with AIDS, to be medical tested. And I understand where that kind of confusion would come from. Why is the United States coming here? This has nothing to do with the United States. And as you know as well as I do, Fiona, the resettlement regime is confusing. It doesn't really fit anywhere in our, it's like this kind of like feel good about yourself geopolitics. But so it happened pretty quickly. Of course, Geneva thought, yeah, they're going to be so happy about this. So they went in like, this is what resettlement is going to do to you. And then there were a lot of people that were like, well, no, this isn't necessarily what we want. And then, to be fair, there were some leaders that didn't want it to happen. And since they were the leaders, they probably, I'm not sure they told them rumors. I don't think that was the case. But I think they didn't necessarily say immediately, yeah, let's all go. So I think the resettlement process happened between 2008 and 2016. So it was over 8 years, which is actually pretty quick for mass resettlement. By the end, most of the leaders had left. And I think the question about, I think the advantages of proximity eventually just ended up being outweighed by the problems of precarity. So it turned out, like, Teknath Rajal, one of the most famous political prisoners, he couldn't get permission to go. He has a lot to say. He couldn't leave Nepal. They let him stay in Nepal. He's still there, but he couldn't leave Nepal. So, it's not that proximity didn't have the advantages, but there was too much else that was problematic to allow it to be the only thing. And now most of the activists are in exile. And the ones that are still there, like DNS Dakal, another one just died, NB Giri, I don't know if you knew him. They're starting to die. So yeah, this next generation will do something different in this diaspora life cycle. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you for the brilliant talk.
Thanks, Prem.
For not having read your book, so my questions are going to be tangential because of
No, it's
that,
okay.
I suppose. So when you were talking, I was very much reminded of the Nepali novel Homeland, which Michael has written about, of course. The arrival of Nepali laborer and the travails of that, and in that sense, it becomes a document of difficult arrival, and because he's headed to India, studying for India.
Yeah.
In that sense, there are lots of other stories written in Nepali about that experience, which precedes the refugee crisis. So that's just I mean, there's no question there.
That's right. Yeah, that's.
It's just, it was very, reminiscent for me, having read a little bit of Nepali literature. So my question is really, when you talk about precarity, and of course this novel particularly is about
Migrant precarity.
precarity.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm coming from a very sort of a theoretical background, getting interested in refugee, the figure of the refugee, and of course I go back to Agamben, where he talks about inclusionary exclusion, the liminality of the figure.
Yeah.
And in a sense, your talk, and I'm sure your book also delineates that. So we can talk about a differentiation because, of course, the camps that are in Nepal and in India, in Jaigaon, just across Funchuling, thousands of them, tens of thousands, lakhs, and they get resettled in that map you showed in numbers. So the experience is obviously differentiated. It's about where they land up,
Yes.
what state regimes they are put under. So there is that. So I'm just interested in whether you describe the layeredness of that experience, and which provides a sort of a comparison in that sense, right? So that's one question.
Okay. Yep.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Yep.
One person, one question. Let me tell you Susan for the answer. Come back to you again.
Oh, okay, sure. Great question, Prem, and it reminded me of something that I'd wanted to say. I don't look too much of the layered. I love that expression, layered precarity. I don't look too much about it like kind of comparing different countries of the global north. It was certainly true that India and Nepal had a very different experience. And what DNS Takal, the one that I showed you here, ended up saying is, if we had not gone to Nepal, that's DNS Takal, it's the title of one of the chapters is, we would have become beggars in Bombay, which is to say India had no interest in recognizing the population as refugees. And in fact, there are some, that's what I thought you were asking about, Kaya, actually, is that there are many that have just disappeared into the woodwork. There's actually no research on them. There was one Human Rights Watch report about those that were in India and never made it to Nepal, but they're kind of gone to history. We don't really know. But there was something else I was going to say, and I've just lost it. Darn it. It was about the layers of precarity. I forgot. I'm sorry. I'll come back to it. Yeah.
Can I abuse my position now?
Of course. Yeah.
One thing that, looking at the whole kind of saga and the way it's panned out, particularly in Bhutan, post-refugee departure, post-resettlement, I've always wondered, and I don't have any answers, and maybe you thought about this too, Susan, what is the relationship between the departure, flight, expulsion, or whatever, of the refugees and the political changes that were subsequently brought in of this kind of limited democratization that happened in Bhutan after they'd gone?
Yeah.
Is it possible that one is a precondition for the other?
Oh, that's so controversial. I mean, I know that's why you're asking it. It's a saying a country can only start to be representative when it doesn't have a troublesome population within it. I mean, that's
Well, it doesn't have a large minority.
a large minority, yeah.
Who might find themselves represented proportionately if they move to democracy, and therefore, so
Yeah, I mean,
completely unanswerable question probably, but
oh, it's a terrific one theoretically. It's certainly, dare I bring up Israel-Palestine? I mean, it's certainly been it was the question for many years. Can we be a democracy if we have a large population in our midst that is not the same as us. But I mean, I find it problematic because the vast majority of, and you know this, the vast majority of Bhutanese Nepalis, they wanted representation, but not in a dangerous way. They just wanted, like, to be part of the polity. I mean, look, maybe the whole idea, like, but we want to be able to speak Nepali. Some in the north found that threatening. And so when there were too many asking for that, it became problematic enough. Wow. Oh, that's depressing, hey? You can only have democracy once you expel 1/6 of your population. Yeah.
I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying, is there a relationship between that and that, or is it just that, you know, those two things happen independently of each other? You know, I don't know.
Well, again, as I said, the refugee activists would say that it happened because they were the ones that made noise about democracy. Your argument is a good one and is not in the book and should have been, actually, that, well, there's this other way to look at it. They no longer felt threatened. But there are still up to 80,000 in the country.
Oh, yeah.
So if your argument were correct, they would have had to expel a much larger percentage, right? Or you only, once you're down to only 80,000, you're okay.
Well, I mean, sorry, can I come back on that? Maybe it's to do with who left and who didn't leave. Because the other question that I don't know whether you asked this question is also because there was never really any data on the composition of the population of Bhutan, Nepali population of Bhutan in terms of ethnicity and
Yeah.
caste. You couldn't assess whether particular castes and ethnicities within the Nepali Commonwealth were underrepresented or overrepresented.
You mean in Bhutan?
So if the Nepali population of Bhutan was, let's say, 20% Brahmin,
Yeah.
okay, and we know that Brahmins tend to be primarily the ones who tend to be more likely
Right.
to be literate and more likely to be political.
Yeah.
If the Nepali population of Bhutan had 20% Brahmins, and then you discovered that the refugee population in the camps was 50% Brahmins, that would suggest that the Bhutanese knew that the Brahmins were likely to be more of a problem going forward than the other castes. And therefore,
Point taken.
because you don't have the data about the population.
That's, yeah.
You can't compare it to the population of camps. So you can't test that hypothesis because the data isn't there. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely see what you mean, but it could be caste or it could just be the troublemakers. Now, maybe they were the same thing. Well, except that, I mean, Ratan Gazmir is Dalit.
Yeah, indeed.
Really interesting case. Yeah. And of course, you know, RKD was Sharchops. He wasn't even. But I think no one's done that. If anyone was going to do it, it would be you, Michael, not me, because I don't.
The data isn't there, obviously isn't available, so you can't, no one can do it.
Yeah.
Unless they have access to that historic data, which
Yeah.
probably doesn't exist anyway.
I mean, I think the way to back into it is like when you hear about the stories of people that didn't leave immediately. Because the stories of those that left immediately was like their village head said, go, let's go. We're not safe here. And some of them were threatened specifically, and some were just kind of part of this big group, like, we're gonna go and we'll come back, or we won't come back, or we'll be treated better there. But there were others, like one of the ones that I talk about in the book, YP Dungal, who was not only well educated, but like he had in 1989, prior to being expelled, been a civil servant that lived in Berlin. He had a piece of the Berlin Wall in his refugee camp hut. That's how well educated he was. Like he'd traveled internationally. He'd seen the Berlin Wall fall. He left in 1994, I think, which is to say that YP Dungal was not going to threaten democracy. So I'm not sure that helps to answer your question, but I don't like the question. I'm worried about the implication of the question.
Yes.
And I know you didn't ask it to be, I mean, it's incendiary in the best possible way. But anyway, yeah.
I mean, this is very interesting. I know nothing about this, and I think you went over it in your slides, but so forgive me if I'm. But so were the expulsions were they mass or were they targeted against political, like what was the form that the expulsion, was it like a government decree or militia, like kind of
I feel like I need to have Michael help me with this one.
militias or?
Because Michael wrote the book on it, and then I
Okay,
no, but,
sorry,
I mean, please weigh in. My short version is a combo. Like, essentially, there were people that kind of went to the South, started rounding people up, and anyone that had been involved in those protests was targeted. You just had to go. You had to just be in the same place at the same time, and then they visited. It was a small country, so all they had to do was like this. You know, they could at that local level kind of identify people.
So, but it was political engagement rather than like ethnicity or.
Well, there was the census. The census is very crucial here as well.
Right.
A lot of the demonstrations, anti-government demonstrations, were largely sparked off by insecurity produced by the census.
Which identified that, I can't remember what percentage, but a significant percentage of those in the South were not citizens. It was,
It's also had a demographic element.
So they brought in a new nationality act, a new criteria. So it was specified that you had to produce land tax documents for the specific year of 1959.
58, I think. You know.
The 58. That's right.
He's the expert.
The year that the
Yeah,
previous
58.
nationality act came
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe it's a long time since I've but it was like, if you haven't got those documents, then there was, I think it was
Seven kinds of citizenship, yeah, or categories.
The only one that you could be that was secure was number one. And if you're anything else,
You could be expelled.
Okay.
you could be expelled from that.
So it's a type of not denationalization per se, but a sort of classification.
No, it was a denationalization.
Yeah, denationalisation, and then of course when there was a political response to it, when people were arrested, and it was like, we'll let you go if you didn't bring your family with you, and we'll harass your family.
I mean, there were people that were found to be not nationals then who were not kicked out. So they remain there today. And some of them are starting to get citizenship now. And it is estimated, although we really don't know, up to 80,000 who are still stateless, 30 years later. So it wasn't that after those protests they said, okay, now every single Bhutanese Nepali who doesn't have citizenship is a troublemaker, we're gonna get them out. It was family connections. So I think there were places where it was like Samche was a district where there were a lot. There was, because they were close to by the way, that's the other proximity thing. They were close to the border. They had been educated in places like Kalimpong, because there was much better education, or there was, yeah, actually there was. At that time, there was very, very good education across the border in India. So there were the populations near the border were already used to speaking about rights and representation in a way that Northerners were not at that time.
Was there, I don't want to take people's time, but was there a cross-border dimension in that it could also be seen as creating like a buffer zone of where there was like back and forth with activism?
Absolutely, from the 1950s on. Because I didn't tell it well, but in the book I tell it well, or I tell it better. The Bhutan State Congress in 1950, they went across the border after kind of protesting, like they were not well accepted. They crossed the border into India, where they then tried to kind of like start a march. They tried to model themselves on India. There had just been independence in India, so it wasn't that they necessarily wanted independence, but like we want to see the same kind of thing. And there was very much cross-border, and that's exactly, to your question, Anya, Kaya, what Bhutan was scared of. All of this cross-border stuff that's causing trouble for us.
Okay.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
it was demographic, geographic, and political.
It was all in the mix.
I'm still puzzled by your title, the ecosystem, which kind of, implies there's a self-healing or something. And you've laid out proximity very much into place, and you haven't really spoken about landscape, but for me it sounds very much like you're trying to say that place and matters, but you're not quite touching memory. But then on the other hand, we've spoken a lot about sort of inherited trauma and memorial and
Yeah.
picture and so on. So I'm wondering about sort of your, if we, I get your point about Agamben and the Homosaker and the expelling of the scapegoat. That's all there. But the other dimension clearly is the memorialization and the waiting and the lost time as it is in the sense of yes and hate and the unfulfilled, the extremely long waiting that goes beyond your own death. And I was wondering whether you capture in your book also that dimension of time. So when you speak about proximity, do you speak about place or do you speak about time?
That's such a great question. What's your name?
Stephanie.
Stephanie, that's such a great question. So I don't talk about time. I have since then written an article about the intergenerational aspect of this trauma, which touches a lot more on the memory piece. And I think you're right. I think it would have been useful, frankly, for me to use proximity in a different way. But I really wanted to talk about physical location. Now, or the physical. So that's kind of what I was going for then. And maybe it wasn't nuanced enough. And I would love for someone to write another article and critique me and say, Banki should have nuanced her work by using temporal qualities as well. But I will say, if the word ecosystem suggests healing, I did not mean it to. I simply meant that it mirrors ecosystems. And some ecosystems fail. So I didn't I hope it's hopeful. I hope that there can be an ecosystem which allows people from the distant diaspora and the proximate diaspora to work together to eventually show the Bhutanese government, like, some of us want to come back, even just as tourists. They can't even go as tourists. Ratan Guzman tried to go as a tourist. He couldn't even get in as a tourist. Now that so many have resettled, like they have good jobs, they are actually ripe for creating the possibility of reconciliation, and that's because of the expanded ecosystem. But to your general point about language, I did not mean for the word ecosystem to necessarily be positive, because physical ecosystems fail. I simply meant that just in the same way that in a physical ecosystem, different physical places, I was talking about the physical, are differentiated by where they are, and what they do is differentiated by where they are. And that is my argument about what a physical ecosystem is in the real world, in an organic ecosystem, and in this. I really love your point about the fact that when harms are more recent, they may have more currency. But as generational scholars, like migration generational scholars like Alice Block will show you, it's not linear. It's not like the people that are the most recently to the harm have the most painful, and then it just goes down and down and down. No, often that middle generation, they're so busy trying to get on with their lives, especially in countries of resettlement, get jobs, et cetera, and it is often their children that pick up the mantle and say, what happened to you? What was that? And in fact, there is a really beautiful but a very beautiful small group of next generation who are starting to do that with the example of the Bhutanese Nepalis. So I love the nuancing of proximity to include temporal. Thank you.
Well, let Frame have the last question. I think it's hot in this round now.
So hot.
You're the closest person geographically
Proximately, yeah, that's right. You're proximate.
Controversial question.
Yeah,
Following on the keyword ecosystem.
yeah.
And it's in your title, the politics of exile, right, in the ecosystem. And when you talk about diasporic Nepalese, I'm from the Darjeeling, Kalimpong, Sikkim hills, right? So obviously you know that there was a coinage, Gorkha, to distance itself from the idea of the Nepali. So we have questions related to sovereignty, citizenship, what have you. You can add transnational, whatever you use. Your words, right? You even use the word Greater Nepal.
Yeah.
And now recently, I just came back from Kalimpong, Sikkim. There was a use of the word Greater Sikkim because there are players in Kalimpong, Darjeeling who want to be merged with Sikkim, right? There's also that kind of movement. They were stopped at the border, that's another thing.
No, that's
But
fascinating.
This is a really messy kind of situation. So in terms of that, that's just the preference, right? In terms of that, diasporic Nepalese in Gorkhaland, in Sikkim, right? Some people refuse that label. And I mean, Sikkimis, of course, go along with it. They are Nepalese, right? They're not diasporic Nepalese in that sense. Some of the elites think of Kathmandu as the cultural center. Some people want to very actively distance themselves because they feel that they're part of a nation, even though they are Sikkimis. So you have these politics around domicile and about a different kind of identity, right? So that is the question. That's the question. How do you in your ecosystem include or exclude
Excuse me.
diasporic Nepalese?
Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
In those areas, in a sense, right? Because the question of refugee, illegality, citizenship has also surfaced there, which has propelled the movements there.
I mean, that needs to be another book, frankly, and it's a really great question. It's not one that I feel that I can answer in terms of this ecosystem, but you totally it's like a crazy ecosystem. It's like it has so much going on in there, and you don't even, what's the home now? Is it Sikkim? Is it Nepal? I mean, we don't even know how kind of far back to go. But you're right, the point about Greater Sikkim means that I don't know, are there, if we talk about the distant diaspora, are there Sikkimis in the distant diaspora in the UK, in Australia, in the United States that are pushing for Greater Sikkim?
Very few. I don't think the Sikkimis want, it's not the Sikkimis who want. It is
the Gorkhas.
The poorer cousins in the Darjeeling, Kalimpong.
Yeah.
Who think that they've given.
That's what I meant, sorry, them in diaspora. But so they're only there. There is no distant diaspora. I mean, that's a great case. That's fascinating. And of course, yeah, I mean, we can bring Benedict Anderson into this and like, what does it mean to be a nationalist that is long distance in time, but not in place? We could go back to your question about temporal qualities, Stephanie.
Susan, I think
Yeah, we're all hot and tired, my God.
enough, and I think that's been great.
Yeah,
We've
great.
had such a great discussion, and
Yeah.
so many aspects of this very complicated story has been useful for you as
Very useful. Great questions, guys. Yeah,
for us. So
yeah.
thanks everybody for
Thank
coming
you.
out, and thanks Susan.
Thank you to you.